Sam and Curry had dreamed of a family filled with joy and laughter. They finally had it, with the arrival of their twin daughters, Mirian and Lillian. The home was alive with new energy, the walls echoing with giggles and cries. Every day felt like a precious gift. Their days were marked by soft lullabies, shared glances, and that special love that only comes with parenthood. In their hearts, life felt complete. Moments passed in a joyful blur, first steps, first words, warm family gatherings. The twins brought happiness to everyone they met. Their lives felt complete. But one day, that happiness began to fade. 18 months after their birth, Lillian fell sick. At first, it seemed minor, just a few nights of worry. But soon, the family found themselves in the sterile, cold halls of the hospital more often than in the warmth of their home. Weeks of waiting turned to months of fear. Lillian grew weaker, her small body barely clinging to life. Curry sat by her bedside day after day, watching, hoping, yet feeling the shadow of what was coming. The steady beep of the machines became her constant companion, a sound that blended with her heartbeat, a reminder of the thin thread keeping Lillian there. And then, one day, that sound stopped. Just a flat, steady note, cutting through the air like a sharp knife. The nurses rushed in, followed by the doctor. Curry's world became a blur of motion around her, voices and words she didn't want to hear. Then, a hand on her shoulder. A gentle voice. Lillian was gone. For Sam, the news hit like a wave. He left work and rushed to the hospital, only to be met by the sight of his lifeless daughter in Curry's arms. He crumbled. Together, they held her one last time, then carried her home to rest. Family and friends gathered, offering words of comfort, but their words felt hollow. Nothing could fill the space Lillian left behind. Mirian, just a little girl, struggled to understand. She could feel something was wrong, but she wanted her sister back. Not any sister, her sister, Lillian. They buried her with heavy hearts. But one thing remained. Lillian had a doll, a simple toy she held close, day and night. A soft, worn thing she called Little Lily. Lillian had held it in her arms during her final moments. When she passed, the doll slipped from her hand. It stayed with the family, a silent reminder of what they'd lost. Mirian took it with her everywhere, almost as if her sister was still there beside her. She dressed it, whispered to it, told it her secrets. In her young heart, little Lily wasn't just a doll. It was her sister, someone she could hold on to in a world that suddenly felt so big, so empty. Every day, Mirian clung to that doll, filling the silence with memories and pretending that maybe, just maybe, Lillian was still there. 2 years passed since Lillian's death, but the weight of her absence lingered. Every corner of the house still held her memory, each room echoing with the ghost of laughter that no one could quite forget. But time moved on, as it always does, and soon, Curry found herself cradling a new baby girl. A fresh start, they thought, a chance to heal, a way to bring some light back to Mirian's eyes. The new baby brought smiles, first giggles, tiny hands that reached out with innocence. Sam and Curry watched their family grow with cautious hope. For them, this little one was a promise that life could feel bright again. And yet, even as they looked at their baby with all the love in their hearts, their gaze would drift back to Mirian, who seemed untouched by it all. She would sit quietly, often by herself, clutching something close, a doll, small and worn, with faint marks of use, faded stitches that held so many memories. Little Lily, she called it, the same name her sister had given it. The very same doll that Lillian had held close until her last breath. The family hoped that Mirian would eventually let go of her sadness, but as time went on, her connection to that doll only grew. She wasn't just carrying it around, she was taking care of it, tending to it as though it were something more than just a toy. When they called her down for dinner, Mirian would come with the doll in her arms, carefully setting it down beside her, sharing her food in tiny gestures, pretending to feed her sister. And when the new baby cooed and reached out, hoping for attention from her big sister, Mirian hardly seemed to notice. Her world had become the doll, and the doll alone. In the evenings, Mirian would sit on her bed, whispering secrets to little Lily, telling it stories, brushing its worn hair with tender hands. If you looked closely, it almost seemed as though the doll was responding, just tiny movements here and there, small enough to ignore. But sometimes, when the house was quiet, those movements seemed more than just tricks of the eye. It would feel, just for a moment, like the doll was listening. One night, after a day of carrying little Lily everywhere with her, Mirian lay down in bed, her small hands clutching the doll as she settled under the covers. She stared at its glassy eyes, whispering, "Tell me a bedtime story, Lillian. Please." Silence filled the room. She repeated the request, her voice softer, more pleading. "Tell me a story," but there was only silence, and soon her eyes closed, and she drifted to sleep. In her dreams, Mirian found herself somewhere strange. She was no longer in her cozy bedroom, but standing alone before an old, weathered house. It was dark, the walls cracked, the windows covered in dust. She felt a chill run through her, but someone, was calling her name from inside. She pushed open the door and stepped into the shadowed rooms, her heart beating faster as she moved further inside. And there, standing in a dim corner, was her sister, Lillian. But this Lillian wasn't the same as she remembered. She looked pale, her eyes darker, her smile thin and strange. "You want a bedtime story, don't you?" Lillian asked, her voice soft and echoing in the emptiness of the house. Mirian nodded, feeling a strange pull, a need she couldn't explain. But Lillian leaned closer and said, "I'll tell you stories, every night. All you have to do is something small for me." Mirian's eyes widened with curiosity, her head tilting slightly, waiting for her sister's request. Lillian's fingers reached out, pointing to a small, dusty book on a shelf nearby. "You have to read from this book," Lillian whispered, "and say the words just as they're written. It's like a chant. If you do it, I'll be able to tell you stories forever." Mirian hesitated, but only for a moment. She was drawn in, unable to turn away from her sister's steady gaze. The words seemed simple enough. What harm could there be in a few words? She opened the book and began to read. The words were strange, unfamiliar, but she spoke them aloud, her voice echoing in the silence. With each line, the air around her felt heavier, the room darker, as though something was pressing down on her. Finally, she reached the last line, her heart racing, her hands shaking as she spoke the final words. Lillian watched her with a look that was almost satisfied. She leaned forward and smiled again, that same strange, unsettling smile. "Now, all you have to do is sign it," Lillian whispered. Mirian looked down at the book, seeing a blank space beneath the words she'd spoken. "How do I sign it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Lillian's eyes glinted as she took Mirian's hand, her cold fingers holding her sister's thumb. "With a little bit of blood," she answered. Before Mirian could pull away, Lillian's fingernail scraped across her thumb, a sharp, quick pain that left a single drop of blood. Lillian guided her hand, pressing the small dot of blood onto the page, sealing the chant. At that moment, the house around them shook, a low rumble that made Mirian's heart race. Shadows seemed to stretch and grow, filling every corner, every crack, until she could see nothing but darkness. And then, as quickly as it started, the dream faded, and Mirian woke up in her bed, gasping, her heart pounding. For a moment, she thought it had all been a strange nightmare. But then she glanced at her pillow and saw it, a small, dusty book, resting beside her. She picked it up, her hands trembling, and opened it to the last page. There, clear as day, was the space where she had placed her blood. Her mind spun. Was it just a dream? Or had she really? She looked down at little Lily, the doll now wearing a small wristband she recognized. It was Lillian's, something she hadn't seen in years. Mirian hugged the doll close, feeling a chill as she whispered, "Thank you, Lillian. I knew you'd come back." And that night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard a faint whisper, a voice from the doll, promising to be with her always. Mirian found herself in that dark house again, that place she now seemed to reach only in her dreams. Shadows clung to the walls, and a coldness filled the air, settling deep into her bones. The silence was so complete she could hear her own breathing, quick and shallow. There was a flicker of movement, and she turned to see her sister, Lillian, standing in the dim light, her face as pale and calm as the moon. She was holding a book, a small, aged book with a thick, dark cover. She stepped closer, extending the book toward Mirian, her expression steady, her eyes fixed and unwavering. "You wanted me to tell you a story," Lillian said softly, her voice like a gentle hum that carried through the emptiness. Mirian nodded, her heart pounding with anticipation and something else she couldn't name. "All you have to do is read this. Just a few words, a little chant. It's easy, Mirian. Do this, and I'll tell you stories every night. We'll always be together." Lillian's eyes glimmered in the shadows, her mouth curled into a faint smile that felt both comforting and strange. Mirian's hand shook as she reached for the book, her fingers brushing the worn cover. With a breath, she opened it. The pages were thin and dark, and as she looked closer, she could see strange symbols scrawled in ink that seemed to sink into the paper. She couldn't understand the words, but Lillian's voice guided her, urging her forward, line by line. Her sister's words slipped into her mind, filling it, making her feel as though the world around her was blurring, slipping away. The only thing that felt real was her sister's voice, soft but strong, leading her through each word, each strange phrase that tumbled from her lips. As Mirian read, a sudden rumble filled the air. She glanced out the broken windows, where storm clouds were gathering fast. The once quiet sky turned dark and heavy, as flashes of lightning tore through the night. Thunder growled in the distance, growing louder with each second, as though the earth itself was waking up. Mirian felt her heart pounding, but she couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. She could feel her sister's presence beside her, steadying her, urging her on. She reached the last line and paused, but Lillian's hand touched hers, cool and firm. "Just one more thing, Mirian," Lillian whispered, leaning closer, her voice a soft murmur in her ear. "Sign it, here. It just needs a little of you." Mirian looked down at the book, seeing the empty space beneath the chant. She glanced at her sister, confused. Lillian's fingers gently took her hand, turning it over, her other hand resting on Mirian's thumb. "A small cut," Lillian explained, her face close, her eyes meeting Mirian's. "It's how you show your promise, that you'll be with me." Before Mirian could say anything, she felt a quick, sharp sting as Lillian's fingernail pressed into her thumb, just enough to draw a small bead of blood. She winced, but Lillian's hand held her steady. The blood dropped onto the page, soaking into the thick paper as though it were meant to be there. At that moment, a fierce bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire room in a blinding flash. Thunder crashed, shaking the walls around them, the sound vibrating through Mirian's bones. She closed her eyes, feeling the darkness close in around her, hearing the storm's roar fade into silence as everything went black. And then, she woke up. Mirian blinked, her heart racing as she looked around her room. The morning light was just starting to filter through the curtains, soft and warm. For a moment, she thought it had all been a dream, a strange, vivid dream. But as she sat up, she felt something hard beside her pillow. Her fingers brushed the object, and her heart skipped a beat. It was the book, the same book from her dream. She held it in her hands, feeling its weight, the rough texture of the cover. Slowly, she opened it, her breath catching as she flipped through the pages, reaching the last one. There, at the bottom of the page, was her bloody thumbprint. The sight made her heart pound, and she looked down at her hand, where a small, faint cut marked her thumb. It hadn't been a dream. She looked back at the book, feeling a strange mixture of fear and something she couldn't name. But that wasn't all. She glanced over at the doll lying beside her. Little Lily. She had placed it there the night before, as she always did, but now, something was different. The doll was wearing a small bracelet on its wrist, a familiar, faded band with a tiny charm. Mirian felt her pulse quicken. It was Lillian's old wristband, one she hadn't seen in years, since her sister had passed. Her hands shook as she reached out, touching the doll's wrist, her fingers brushing over the charm. It felt cold, almost like metal, and yet it filled her with a strange sense of warmth. She pulled her hand back, feeling a chill run through her. The room was quiet, but there was something in the air, a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing. She looked around, feeling her breath catch, but there was no one there. No one, except the doll. She felt its glassy eyes on her, watching, as though it were something more than just a toy. She picked it up, clutching it tightly, feeling its weight in her arms. As she held the doll close, a faint voice drifted into her mind, soft and familiar. "Thank you, Mirian. I'll always be here. Always." Her heart raced, and she pulled the doll closer, whispering back, "Lillian." There was only silence, but she felt something, a presence, something that filled the air around her, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. She couldn't explain it, but she knew, deep down, that her sister was there, in some way she couldn't understand. She hugged the doll, feeling her heart pound, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. That day, Mirian went about her routine, clutching the doll close, feeling her sister's presence with her. And every now and then, she thought she heard that faint whisper again, a voice that seemed to linger just beyond hearing. She didn't tell anyone about the dream, or the book, or the chant. It was her secret, a bond she shared with her sister, something no one else could understand. But as night fell, and she lay in bed once more, clutching little Lily in her arms, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The shadows in her room seemed darker, the silence heavier. And just as her eyes were beginning to close, she heard it again, a soft voice, a whisper that made her heart race and her skin prickle. "I'm here, Mirian. I'm with you, always." It was Mirian's 8th birthday, a day that was meant to be filled with joy and celebration, but a dark cloud hung over the household. Balloons, streamers, and presents were scattered around the living room, yet something felt off. Mirian's family had tried their best to make it a happy occasion, hoping to bring back a spark to the little girl who had endured so much. But as the day wore on, an uneasy feeling crept into the hearts of everyone in the house. As night fell, Mirian lay in her bed, her newly opened gifts tucked safely away. Little Lily was with her, as always, its vacant eyes staring straight ahead. But tonight, the doll seemed different, almost expectant. Mirian sat up, staring at the doll's face, feeling a strange urge to speak. "Did you like my party?" she asked softly, running a hand over little Lily's dress. There was silence, but in that quiet, she felt something shift. She felt watched, as though the doll's gaze was somehow sharper, more aware. She shivered but tried to ignore it, setting the doll beside her and closing her eyes. Then, just as sleep was starting to take her, she heard it, a faint voice, soft but firm, drifting into her mind. "You forgot something," it whispered. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. She looked down at little Lily, her breathing quickening. She could feel the doll's presence pressing on her, filling the room with an unseen weight. It wanted more. It wanted to be part of her life, not just as a toy but as something more. From that night on, things only grew stranger. Little Lily seemed to be everywhere, its eyes following Mirian's every move, its presence constantly demanding her attention. When she sat down to eat, she felt the doll's stare from across the room. When she played outside, it was as though she could feel its tiny eyes watching from the window. And when she went to bed, there was no escaping the feeling that the doll was waiting, watching, wanting. On one particularly quiet evening, Mirian's parents sat together, their faces drawn and worried. They had noticed the change in their daughter, the way she clung to that doll even more than before. They tried talking to her, gently asking if she wanted any new toys or if she was feeling all right. But Mirian only looked back at them, her eyes empty, as though she was far away, lost in some other world. "Little Lily wants a birthday," she whispered one night to her mother, her voice barely audible. Curry froze, looking down at her daughter, a chill creeping up her spine. "What do you mean, sweetie?" Curry asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "She told me," Mirian said, her voice as steady as though it were the most normal thing in the world. "She said she wants what I have, a birthday, presents, a cake." Curry looked at her daughter, her mind racing. She felt a tightness in her chest, an unease that she couldn't shake. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just a child's imagination, but the thought gnawed at her. And then, things took a turn for the worse. The doll's demands became more insistent. When Mirian would go to sleep, she would hear whispers, faint and eerie, filling the quiet of the room. The words were soft, almost like a chant, and though she couldn't always make them out, she knew they were coming from little Lily. The doll seemed to come alive in her dreams, standing beside her bed, its eyes glowing faintly, watching her with an intensity that made her shiver. Mirian's behavior changed. She began speaking to the doll more often, sharing her secrets and wishes with it, treating it as though it were her sister come back to life. The doll, in turn, seemed to respond, not with words, but with small, unsettling gestures. Her family began noticing strange occurrences. A toy would disappear, only to reappear in another room, or a light would flicker, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. One night, Sam was walking down the hall when he heard a faint whisper. He paused, feeling a chill creep up his spine. The voice was soft, like a child's, but there was something wrong about it, something that made his heart race. "It's just my imagination," he muttered, shaking his head. But as he passed Mirian's room, he glanced inside, his breath catching as he saw the doll sitting upright on her bed, its glassy eyes staring straight at him. He could have sworn it was smiling. From then on, strange phenomena seemed to plague their home. Shadows seemed to shift and stretch in unnatural ways, bending around corners, casting shapes that shouldn't be there. Mirrors began to fog over without explanation, and when they cleared, they would sometimes reveal faint shapes, as though something was watching from just beyond. One evening, Curry walked into the living room, only to find the doll sitting in her place at the dinner table, its glassy eyes fixed on her. She shivered, picking it up and moving it back to Mirian's room. But when she returned moments later, the doll was back at the table, sitting exactly where it had been before. "Sam," she whispered, her voice trembling, "this isn't normal." Sam nodded, his face pale. They knew something was terribly wrong, but neither could bring themselves to confront it. They hoped it was just a phase, something that would pass in time. But as the days went by, it only got worse. The whispers grew louder, filling the house at all hours, sometimes sounding like faint chanting, other times like someone calling out, their voice muffled and distant. Doors would creak open on their own, cold drafts would sweep through rooms, and items would go missing, only to reappear in strange places. One night, Curry awoke to a strange sound, a soft scraping, like something small dragging across the floor. She held her breath, listening, as the sound grew closer, inching toward her bedroom door. Her heart pounded as the doorknob slowly turned, the door creaking open just a crack. She saw it, a small shadow, low to the ground, slipping into the room. Her hand reached for Sam's, squeezing tightly, but he was already awake, his face as pale as hers. In the dim light, they saw it. The doll. It was standing by their bed, its head tilted up, its eyes staring straight at them, unblinking. They froze, their minds racing, unable to move, unable to look away. The doll's mouth seemed to twist, forming a faint, eerie smile, and then, in a voice barely more than a whisper, it spoke. "I want my birthday," it said, the words chilling them to the core. I want what she has. I want to be alive. They stared in horror, watching as the doll's tiny fingers reached out, its gaze fixed on them with a hunger that went beyond anything they had ever known. They felt trapped, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the doll's eyes bore into them, filling their minds with a fear that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. From that moment on, the house was never the same. They could feel the doll's presence everywhere, lurking in every shadow, watching from every corner, waiting, always waiting. And every night, they heard that faint whisper, echoing through the halls, reminding them that it was still there, that it would always be there, watching, waiting, wanting more. Days turned into nights, and nights stretched long and eerie. The strange events that plagued the household began to take a darker shape. It was no longer just shadows stretching in unnatural ways or whispers that echoed in the night. Now, something far more terrifying was taking place. Little Lily was no longer the tiny doll that once sat innocently in Mirian's arms. Overnight, it had grown. No one had seen it happen, yet there it stood, an unsettling 3-foot figure with glassy eyes that seemed to watch every movement, every shiver, every breath. The doll had become a presence that filled the room with a cold, heavy silence. Sam and Curry could no longer ignore it. They tried to convince Mirian to let go of little Lily, to put the doll away, but every time they did, she held onto it tighter, clutching it as if her life depended on it. When Mirian would look at them with her wide, innocent eyes and say, "Lillian needs me," they felt a wave of helplessness and dread wash over them. But soon, it was clear that the doll was no longer interested in being just Mirian's companion. The entire family felt its presence, as if it were somehow alive, watching them from every corner. The doll's eyes seemed to flicker open and closed when no one was looking. It would appear in different rooms, sometimes with its head tilted or its hands raised, as if reaching out. And then came the sounds. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, soft footsteps could be heard creeping down the hallway. Sam and Curry would lie in bed, their breaths shallow, as they listened to those tiny steps drawing closer, closer to their door. On some nights, they would catch a glimpse of the doll standing in the shadows of their room, its dark eyes unblinking, fixed on them in the dim light. The doll didn't move, but its presence was enough to make them freeze with fear. One night, unable to bear it any longer, Sam decided to take matters into his own hands. He picked up little Lily, its cold, porcelain face staring up at him. His hands shook as he carried the doll outside, his heart pounding. In the backyard, he found an old shovel, his mind racing with thoughts of burying it, getting rid of it for good. With a single determined motion, he brought the shovel down, smashing it into the doll's face. The porcelain shattered under the force, its pieces scattering across the ground. Sam breathed a sigh of relief, feeling as though he had finally broken the curse. But when he returned to the house, his relief turned to horror. There, in Mirian's room, sitting on her bed as though nothing had happened, was little Lily, completely unharmed. Its face was untouched, its eyes as cold and unblinking as ever. Sam's hands began to shake, his heart pounding as he stumbled back, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. Curry, seeing her husband's fear, decided that they needed help. They reached out to a local priest, hoping that he could provide some explanation, some way to rid their home of this cursed presence. The priest listened to their story, his expression growing darker as they described the doll's transformation, Mirian's strange behavior, and the unexplainable events that had taken over their lives. "This is no ordinary doll," he said quietly, his voice filled with a gravity that chilled them. "The chant, whatever words your daughter spoke, has bound something to this object. Something, not of this world." He advised them to keep the doll out of reach, to never speak to it, and to avoid any contact. But as he spoke, he couldn't hide the uncertainty in his eyes. It was clear that even he wasn't certain they could rid themselves of the doll's influence. Despite the priest's warning, the doll continued to haunt their every moment. It seemed to grow stronger, its presence more menacing. And then, one night, the doll's true power was unleashed. It was late, the house shrouded in darkness, when a sudden crash jolted them awake. Sam and Curry raced down the hall, their footsteps echoing as they reached Mirian's room. There, they found little Lily standing in the center of the room, as though it had been waiting for them. Its once porcelain skin now seemed darker, almost human-like, its eyes no longer the dull, glassy orbs of a toy. Instead, they held a fierce, unnatural light that sent a chill through their bones. The air grew thick, heavy, as if some unseen force was pressing down on them, suffocating them. In that moment, the doll moved. Not a simple tilt of the head or flicker of the eyes, but a full, deliberate step forward. Its tiny feet dragged across the floor, each movement slow and deliberate, its eyes fixed on them with a look that could only be described as hunger. The family stood frozen, watching in horror as the doll took another step, then another, closing the distance between them. Desperation took over. Sam lunged forward, grabbing the doll and flinging it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening thud, but instead of falling lifelessly to the ground, it simply stood back up, as though nothing had happened. The doll's mouth twisted into a faint smile, its eyes glinting with a terrifying, otherworldly intelligence. Frantic, Curry grabbed a candle and tried to burn it, holding the flame close to the doll's face. But as the fire touched it, the doll let out a low, guttural sound, something that sounded almost like laughter. The flame did nothing, it simply flickered and died, leaving them in darkness. In their desperation, Sam and Curry turned to the only option they had left. They grabbed Mirian and ran, rushing down the stairs and into the living room, where they tried to barricade the door. But before they could block the entrance, the doll was there, standing at the foot of the stairs, its shadow stretching across the floor, filling the room with a chilling darkness. The doll seemed to grow taller, its figure towering over them, its presence filling the room like a dark cloud. It took a step forward, its face twisted in a smile that was too wide, too unnatural. Sam tried to push it back, but his hands went numb the moment he touched it, a cold that felt like it was freezing his bones from the inside out. Curry screamed, clutching Mirian, who seemed entranced, her eyes locked onto the doll's face. The doll reached out a hand, its tiny fingers stretching toward them, and in that moment, they felt an overpowering fear, a sense that they were standing on the edge of something dark and terrible. But then, just as the doll was about to reach them, it stopped. Its head tilted to the side, as though listening to something only it could hear. For a moment, there was silence. And then, in a voice that echoed through the room, the doll spoke. "I will be with you, always." And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the doll fell silent. The family stood there, breathing heavily, their hearts pounding, as the doll's eyes closed, and its face returned to its original, blank expression. They didn't wait to see if it would move again. Sam grabbed the doll and threw it into a trunk, locking it tight and burying it deep in the basement, hoping that they would never see it again. But even as they returned upstairs, they couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, still waiting, biding its time. And every night, as they lay in bed, they heard it, the faint sound of footsteps, moving slowly down the hall, pausing just outside their door, as though reminding them that it was still there, just out of reach, but never truly gone. After endless nights of terror and failed attempts to rid themselves of the doll, Sam and Curry were on the brink of collapse. They could no longer close their eyes without hearing the whispers, without sensing that unsettling, watchful presence near them. Desperate for a solution, they reached out one last time to the priest, hoping for a way to end this nightmare for good. The priest arrived, his face grave and his hands carrying a worn, ancient book with symbols they couldn't understand. He told them that what was inside the doll was not just a restless spirit but something far darker. The chant that Mirian had unknowingly spoken had bound it to this world, giving it a hold on their home and their lives. The priest explained that the only way to break this attachment was through a banishing ritual, one that would require every ounce of strength and resolve they had left. The ritual was to be performed at midnight, when, he warned, the spirit's hold would be at its weakest. In a circle of salt, the family placed little Lily, who sat upright, eyes empty but somehow aware. The priest lit candles, each flame flickering as though in protest, and he began to chant words that filled the air with an oppressive weight. As the ritual continued, the room grew colder, the flames of the candles flickering wildly, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. Mirian, clutching her mother's hand, whispered, "Lillian doesn't want to go." Her words sent a chill through Sam and Curry, who tightened their grip on her, bracing themselves for whatever would come next. The priest's voice grew louder, stronger, pushing against the invisible weight that seemed to press down on them. Suddenly, the doll began to shake. Its head turned slowly, facing each family member with that familiar, chilling smile. And then, a low, guttural sound filled the room, a sound that seemed to come not from the doll but from the very walls around them. The priest held his ground, his chants unwavering, even as the doll's face began to crack, pieces of porcelain chipping away to reveal something dark and pulsing beneath. The candles flared brightly, and a gust of cold wind blew through the room, snuffing them out one by one. Just as the final candle died, the doll collapsed, lifeless, its once menacing smile frozen in place, now cracked and broken. There was a moment of silence, thick and heavy. Sam and Curry looked at each other, their breaths shallow and their faces pale. It was over. Or so they hoped. They buried the remains of the doll deep in the woods that night, far from their home, far from their lives. Days passed, and a sense of calm finally returned to their home. Mirian seemed lighter, more herself. They watched her playing in the garden, laughing again, her face no longer shadowed by whatever darkness had held her. Yet, even in this newfound peace, a lingering unease crept in. Every so often, Mirian would stop, tilt her head, as if listening to something they couldn't hear. Sometimes, she would look into the corners of the room and whisper softly, "Good night, Lillian." And while they tried to tell themselves it was just a habit, a way for her to let go, deep down, they knew that perhaps it wasn't entirely gone. One evening, as Mirian lay in bed, Curry tucked her in, kissed her on the forehead, and turned off the light. She stepped out, pausing for just a moment to glance back, her eyes catching a shadowy shape on Mirian's shelf, the last remnant of the doll's cracked wristband that Mirian had kept, though they tried to throw it away. Late that night, as the house lay quiet, something faint broke the silence. It was a whisper, so soft it could barely be heard, but there it was. A murmur, a chillingly familiar voice that seemed to drift from Mirian's room. Sam and Curry sat up, straining to listen, their hearts racing. The voice was faint but unmistakable, "Good night, Mirian." The house fell silent once more, but that silence held a sense of dread, an unspoken understanding that this might not be the end. Weeks later, the family tried to move on, resuming a normal routine. Sam took on extra work, Curry focused on Mirian, doing everything they could to rebuild a sense of peace. But every so often, something would happen, a picture frame would fall, the lights would flicker, or a cold draft would sweep through the room with no clear source. They would look at each other, each wondering if the other had noticed, but neither dared to speak of it. Finally, one night, long after everyone had gone to bed, a final sign appeared. In the basement, where they'd stored the last remnants of the doll, they found a single footprint, small yet unmistakable, imprinted in the dust on the floor. The sight of it sent a shiver through them both, reminder that some bonds are not so easily broken, that some spirits linger even when we wish them gone. As they turned to leave, Curry whispered a soft prayer, hoping that whatever remnants remained would finally find rest. In the end, the family tried to move forward, to bury the memories along with the broken pieces of that terrible doll. They wanted to believe that the horror was finally over, that peace had returned to their lives. But the shadows in the house still felt a little too dark, the nights a little too quiet. And every so often, Mirian would stop, tilt her head, as though listening to someone just out of sight. Did they truly escape it, or was something still waiting, hidden in the silence? What do you think? Do you believe the family will ever find true peace? Or is the nightmare just beginning? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed The Doll is Demon Possessed, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves horror. And stay tuned, there are even darker stories waiting for you. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that'll keep you up at night.